I'm actually extremely grateful to be here this morning because when I woke up, I was in the middle of a dream that I was hosting some kind of a big comic fundraiser that was black tie at the San Francisco Opera House, and I had no idea what I was doing. And then I realized that I was instead giving a keynote to a whole bunch of computer security people who are way smarter than I am, and I felt much more relaxed. But so we're going to talk about Dr. Strangevote this morning. And I want first to start with a brief word about elections, because the context for this particular computer security and accuracy and integrity problem is elections. And elections are important because in a democracy, that is how we transfer power in an orderly manner. That is how we decide what our collective will is and how we have chosen to give up bullets and instead rely on ballots. And it is really critical for us to get this right. We are willing to vote and to have the results announced and to accept the outcome even if the candidate or candidates that we have chosen do not win, because we believe that the process was fair and orderly and that every vote was counted as it was cast, and we believe that we will have an attempt to change the result in the next election cycle. And if we stop being able to believe that that's what happens in elections, then we basically undermine the entire principle of democracy and self-rule. So it becomes the most critical problem to having a democracy that succeeds, to have elections that people can trust. And we have to trust the whole system. That system includes everything. It includes everything from the process of voter registration to creating the rolls correctly at the polling place. Those rolls are largely produced by a computer relying on a database that no regular human being who's not an employee of the elections division ever sees, and that largely still is a major challenge in terms of providing transparency, accountability, and auditing. The process includes, of course, the voting machines that are in the polling place or whatever the voting equipment is, the physical transfer of all of the equipment that deals with voting, whether it be just a simple ballot box and a piece of paper with an X or an O on it, or much more complex equipment. It includes the tallying mechanism, and it includes the means for detecting and correcting errors. We need to know when something's going wrong. We need to have a process for determining quickly how to recover from it, and then we need to know what is accurate and what's not. And these challenges all go back to the very first elections that were ever conducted. I think when cave people started electing leaders by putting a pile of white rocks in one place and black rocks in another, there probably were attempts to change the outcome without campaigning and getting the number of supporters that you wanted. So the process of deterring cheating in this is one that I think is as old as elections themselves, given the nature of human beings. But if we cannot trust every step of this process, then it's really irrational to expect citizens to learn the issues, evaluate the candidates, and take the time to vote. And that's especially true because in many states, as we've seen recently, voting can mean standing in line for a long time. In Ohio in 2004, we had people who stood in line in the rain in November for up to 9 hours in order to cast ballots. In November of 2006 in Orange County, we had people standing in line with little kids for 2 and 3 hours. Now, I know what it's like to stand in line with a little kid in the grocery store for 2 minutes. So it really takes a great deal of will to stand in line for a long time and a great commitment. But voting is the key to democracy, and running elections properly is the key to voting. So, how are we doing? All right. The fact that I observed this bumper sticker and it was a gift from two women in Texas who are longtime election integrity activists, tells me that we have some work to do with the public in assuring them that the voting process meets our high standards for security, integrity, and accuracy. I thought it was a pretty funny bumper sticker, but I really want to make some serious points about the several ideas that are captured by this bumper sticker. First, of course, unwanted presidencies is an attention grabber, but the principle is equally relevant to all contests, including other federal offices, state and local offices, and ballot measures. Second, the bumper sticker makes no mention of electronic voting machines because it doesn't need to. The opposition to e-voting is obvious. Hand counting means paper ballots. You can't hand count an e-voting machine. And I'm going to return later to why I personally don't think we need to hand count every ballot in every election, and why that's, I think, really not even an option in a state like California with very long, complex ballots, as many as 120 races, and in Los Angeles County alone, 330 different ballot types. It would be a very complex and most likely error-prone project to try to hand count. The bumper sticker also makes no mention of lever voting machines, which are a century-old alternative that some are arguing we should keep, particularly in New York. The lever voting machine actually came about as a result of people figuring out how to cheat in the handwritten paper ballots that were common in this country. I had somebody come talk to me about elections in Brooklyn, and they talked to me about a guy named Short Pencil Louie. And Short Pencil Louie, apparently, he was one of the talliers, and he used to keep a piece of graphite secreted under one fingernail, and when he would go into the tally room, he would basically deface ballots in such a way that they were no longer countable. And both parties in New York apparently did this on a regular basis, and the lever voting machine was brought in as a solution to the tampering by the Short Pencil Louies of the world. And it is basically a mechanical device. It has a series of gears, and when you pull the lever, the curtain opens and all of the gears turn and your votes are recorded. But in the process of evaluating voting systems, one of the things that I learned was how to hack a lever voting machine. And this is the tool that we can use to accomplish that. There's another one somewhere around here in a pocket. I have a toothpick, which is another way to do it. And it actually is very similar to the problem of computer hacking in that it's very difficult to detect it. If you jam this pencil lead into one gear in a lever voting machine in which you wish to reduce the number of votes that are counted, you will keep that gear from turning completely when the lever is pulled. But the pencil lead, being soft, will work its way out over the course of the election day. And unless someone does a forensic analysis of every gear on every lever voting machine, it's basically impossible to determine that there has been tampering. And it's certainly impossible to recover the accurate number of votes that were cast. There's no way to recover gracefully, or not, to recover at all if you have an error in a lever voting machine. So this hand counting also, I think, is a reference to the lever voting machines. The third point is that for an election outcome to be unwanted, which is the focus here, no crime is required. To be sure, intentional criminal tampering can cause an incorrect election result. And numerous studies, and I'll talk about California's in a moment, have now proven the serious risk of tampering by vendor insiders, rogue election employees, or poll workers, and even individual voters. And again, I don't think this is anything that is specific to the current technology that is in use, the variety of technology in use in elections. Of course, one of the studies was California's 2007 top-to-bottom review. This review subjected 3 of the most widely used voting systems to source code review, documentation review, and penetration testing by top academic and private computer security experts, many of whom are here in this room. For those of you who were not able to hear the excellent papers at the EVT electronic voting technology proceedings on Monday and Tuesday, or the formal studies that have been done, I highly recommend them. I think that the executive summary probably is sufficient to give you an idea of what it is that we came across. And I sometimes wonder if those who continue to deny the stunning insecurities of the electronic voting systems that are currently on the market are the soulmates of those who persist in denying the overwhelming evidence of global warming. Either way, even if we are wrong, in either case, the possibility of errors, tampering, or climate change, I think, should lead a rational person to take action to prevent negative outcomes, because the price of prevention is a lot lower than the cost of allowing the unwanted consequences of not taking action. I am not, though, just going to talk about deliberate tampering, because there is also the potential for mistakes and screw-ups, both in the codes and in the procedures. A mistake can also cause the wrong candidate to be declared the winner in an election using direct recording or DRE voting machines, and there are a number of kinds of mistakes that are possible with DREs. A mistake in programming, a mistake in creating the electronic ballot definitions that tell an e-voting machine what to display on its screen and what to record in its memory. This is one of our earliest experiences in California with errors. An early election in Orange County in which a large number of voters were presented with the wrong ballot type on the electronic voting machine. The programming was wrong. They had listed candidates which they were not legally entitled to vote for, and they did not have listed candidates who they were legally entitled to vote for. You can also have a mistake in calibrating the touchscreen that the voter has to use to record his or her votes, so that the touch buttons or the mapping area is not correctly mapped onto the corresponding electronic grid of the candidates or position choices. And you can have interference with the touchscreen's functioning by something that happens during the course of the day. Something as simple as a voter coming in who had barbecued ribs for lunch and didn't wash their hands thoroughly can alter the vote choices of everyone else who votes on that particular touchscreen machine for the rest of the day. So these mistakes can and do occur, and the worst part is that, like the pencil lead in the lever voting machine, they can be difficult or impossible to detect or correct after the voting is over. And then there are the human errors that don't have to do with the programming of the computer. And when people talk to me about how their procedures ameliorate all of the problems that are potential with electronic voting, I usually ask them if they read the entire instruction booklet for their BlackBerry or iPhone before they began to use it. Most of us don't. I'm going to ask you who in this room read the entire instruction book, because I already know the answer. I then ask some other questions, like, is your BlackBerry or iPhone set to time out after a period with a required password entry, so that if you lose it, everything that's in there doesn't become the possession of whoever happens to pick it up? And you would be surprised at the number of security experts and elections officials who don't have any kind of password protection on the mobile devices that they carry around that basically contain pretty much their whole lives, sometimes including bank passwords, credit card numbers, and so forth. So even when we know what to do as human beings, we don't always do it. And then think about what it takes to actually run an election. And in California alone, on Election Day, we have close to 100,000 poll workers. In this country, the average age of poll workers, I believe, is now 77, the average age. So I had one elections official, I think it was Freddie Oakley, Yolo County, who told me that her worst nightmare was 5 elderly poll workers on Election Day standing around an electronic voting machine that doesn't work, going, So we have a lot of training to do of poll workers, and that is also the source of a lot of difficulty, and that's exacerbated by the fact that as human beings that we tend to stop paying attention if we already know how to do something that we're being instructed how to do. And I really realized this on Monday night when I was flying back here from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and they started the safety. First of all, the computer had in the records that there were no seats available on the plane on which I was flying. When I got on, I was the 7th passenger on a 66-seat airplane. So I don't know what happened to I don't know what happened there, but there clearly was a data error because there were 59 empty seats. So I got on and they began the safety video and I immediately tuned out because I already know, right, what to do. So the same thing happens, I think, with poll workers. When we start instructing poll workers how to do something and they've been poll workers for 20 or 30 or 40 years, it's pretty hard to keep someone's attention when they already know how to do it. So just the challenges of doing that, I think, are complicated. The first day that I went down to see what our top-to-bottom reviewers were doing, I asked them when they were working with the equipment, what are you doing? And they told me, well, the first thing we do is we read the instructions, and when it says, do not turn the machine off during this process, we turn the machine off during that process to see what would happen. And we see whether it loses the results, changes the results, won't reboot, whatever it is. And I was really struck by that because we weren't just looking there for evidence of where people could tamper, but just where is it that somebody who's taking a shortcut, thinks they already know what to do, or is just doing what seems instinctive, can completely affect the results without having any intention whatsoever of changing the outcome or disabling the equipment. So, but I do want to focus briefly on the deliberate attacks that could be launched on direct recording electronic voting machines. Our top-to-bottom review was conducted by teams of top-flight computer security experts from the University of California, Princeton, Stanford, University of Texas, University of Pennsylvania, and others. It was headed up by David Wagner of UC Berkeley and Matt Bishop of UC Davis. The review found a wide variety of flaws in electronic voting systems sold by Sequoia, Hart InterCivic, and Diebold Election Systems, now renamed Premier Election Solutions. Most notably, they discovered that the possibility of viral attacks in which a single corrupted voting machine could spread that corruption as a part of regular processes and procedures to every other component of the voting system. So that one attacker corrupting one machine could subsequently corrupt every voting system in an election jurisdiction in a subsequent election. Poorly implemented cryptography was helpless against such attacks, and equally disturbing was the fact that some really basic things that you don't even need to be a computer security expert to know aren't a good idea were really commonplace. Things like hard coding a password that was the same in every piece of voting equipment, and in some cases a password which was the name of the vendor, or 11111 or something equally guessable. And the fact that you could use a single key to open any voting machine from the same vendor. Now, when you look at the challenge, the logistical challenge of elections, you understand why vendors made those choices. You have 100,000 poll workers in California, almost 23,000 precincts or polling places, and if you have 23,000 different keys, there is absolutely, or 23,000 passwords, there's no question that you're going to have polling places that can't start their electronic voting machine on election morning because somebody will lose the key, somebody will forget the password. There's no way you can have that many people who are primarily volunteers with an average age of 77 who are going to be able to manage at that level. So it's understandable why they did that, but it doesn't give comfort to those of us who are concerned about security. Equally disturbing was the ease by which our researchers were able to defeat the physical security, other physical security features on the equipment, not just the key, but unscrewing housings to bypass a security seal. Put a security seal over here on one side of a clamshell type arrangement, and anybody with a screwdriver could remove 2 screws, open the equipment from the other side, have complete access to everything in it, do whatever they wanted to, close the thing up again, replace the 2 screws, and the security seal is intact. No evidence that there's ever been any tampering. So the attacks were trivial, And if that wasn't enough, I think we should turn momentarily to the new report on the ES&S voting system by a team from the University of Pennsylvania, headed by Professor Matt Blaze. They presented their paper on the vulnerabilities in the ES&S voting system used in counties throughout this country at this week's EVT conference. The paper is on the EVT website. This study was part of the Everest Voting System Security Study commissioned by my fellow Secretary of State Jennifer Brunner of Ohio. And here is some of what they found. Quote, numerous exploitable vulnerabilities in nearly every component of the ES&S system. These vulnerabilities enable attacks that could alter or forge precinct results, install corrupt firmware, and erase audit records. Quote, a voter can surreptitiously delete all vote data and audit logs stored on a touchscreen voting machine using a Palm handheld device and a small magnet. Quote, several attacks could spread virally, propagating between voting machines and back-end systems and vice versa. The system's most serious vulnerabilities stem from four fundamental pervasive deficiencies: ineffective access control, critical errors in input processing, ineffective protection of firmware and software, and ineffective cryptography and data authentication. The silver lining for my state in this otherwise gloomy report is that the configuration of the ES&S voting system conditionally approved for use in California does not include one of the most vulnerable components of the system, the Ivotronic direct recording voting device. It was decertified in California following errors that we observed in an election here, which the vendor blamed on voters with long fingernails. You know, I can't make this stuff up, right? So, now I've just given you a very gloomy report of the state of some of our voting technology. So why, as the title of my talk suggests, have I mostly stopped worrying? Well, it is because we have a pretty good, although not perfect, alternative to direct recording electronic voting. And I should pause for a minute to say that I don't think that a perfect voting system exists or can be created, because for every brilliant idea that we execute perfectly, we will have some equally brilliant person figuring out a way around it. And I have, in my legislative career, spent a lot of time working on identity theft issues. And it became clear to me fairly early that anybody who wanted to get access to Social Security numbers or to a database that has hundreds of thousands of people's home addresses and Social Security numbers had a greater motivation, because of the potential financial reward, than the capabilities that one would expect from the largely government salary paid people whose job it was, or even private company. We have plenty of examples of intrusions and data thefts and insider access. And the greatest threat in the private sector right now to identity theft and the theft of critical information doesn't come from man-in-the-middle or outside attacks. It comes from insider access and from sale of information from somebody who is a clerk making the lowest end salary and who's looking to augment their income by selling data. So we're always going to be chasing, I think, with high-tech crimes and with security issues, the latest exploits. And it is why we're looking at layering security. I don't want a system in which only the key to the voting machine is determinative of the safety of the security and accuracy of the outcome of an election. I don't want a system in which we distribute voting equipment to polling places a week in advance, and the security seal is the only thing that keeps us secure that the equipment hasn't been tampered with. There's just, and when we're talking about identity theft and fiscal systems, financial systems, we're only talking about money. When we talk about elections, we are talking about the power to change everything in our world, the power to start wars, the power to change who gets health care and under what circumstances, the power to deal with global warming in one way or another, or not to deal with it at all. It's really huge. So we have to look for ways in which we can continually assure ourselves that we have really done the what-ifs and that we have covered as many of the bases as possible. And then we have to be prepared for attacks. And one of the things that's ongoing right now that I still don't feel we've done a good enough job with in California is keeping track of the forensics so that if something does happen, we have a way to capture the information in a timely manner. You know, seeing this go to the screensaver right now actually reminds me of a funny story that I have to stop and tell you. I was doing a talk several years ago during the energy crisis in California, and I chaired the Energy Committee, and that's another example of seeing tampering. We saw Enron's bids. We saw what was going on. We didn't have the ability to stop it. Anyway, I had these slides, and they all went up, and my husband had, unbeknownst to me, changed my screensaver. And it was a floating phrase in Spanish that I won't repeat here. You can ask me afterwards. The slides ended, and up comes this phrase in Spanish, fortunately in really tiny type. And I was having a struggle trying to figure out how to turn the computer off because it wasn't right in front of me. And of course, anybody sane at that point does the obvious thing, which is unplug it, right? That solves the problem generally. So if you're ever giving a talk with PowerPoint and it's your computer, please check what's on your screensaver before you get up to the podium. So back to why we've stopped worrying, and I don't worry about the screensaver anymore either. The alternative is voting on paper ballots that are counted with optical scanners using optical scan tally software. Then, and this step cannot be left out, checking the accuracy of the electronic count through hand tallies of a meaningful percentage of randomly selected precincts after every election and for every contest. With this double check, we can deliver rapid, unofficial results while also achieving what many have identified as the holy grail of modern high-speed election tallies, software independence. Hand tallies mean never having to say, "I trust you," to hundreds of thousands of lines of code, no matter how cute and appealing they might be. Optical scanning paper ballots has huge advantages over electronic voting. The voter can verify selections simply by looking at the circles he or she has filled in on the paper ballot. The voter is not challenged to perform what is a cognitively difficult task, which is comparing a display of his or her choices on the touchscreen with a paper audit trail in an entirely different format. And for those of you who have not been engulfed in the computer voting thing, the paper trail is like a cash register tape that is generally an add-on, and it is often under a little plastic screen that can very easily be scratched, which makes it even harder to read the computer printout under the paper trail. You're not allowed to touch it, so you can't bring it closer to you to see the results. It's particularly difficult to expect a voter to check that paper trail under that little piece of plastic when the voter senses the impatience of other voters who've also been waiting in line for a long time, who are lined up waiting to use the voting machine. We've also seen human error come into play here. I was shocked to see videotape on 60 Minutes a couple of years ago of a precinct in which two things happened. One is the cover over the little clear plastic thing had been left down so that the voter couldn't have seen the paper trail if she wanted to. And the other was the election officials in that jurisdiction telling voters, "Oh, don't worry about that paper. That's just for the central office. That has nothing to do with you." And we have seen well-designed studies show that many voters don't attempt to verify their votes, even if they're not told not to bother by election officials and the screen is open, and that of those who do, a high percentage miss discrepancies. It's actually a study that was presented, I believe, last year at Accurate. The rate of people missing errors in a very short election, 8 races, I think, was very significant. A large number of people, I believe it was close to half, did not notice when as many as 4 results were changed between what they had done on the touchscreen and what showed up on the paper ballot, or on the paper trail. And the only statistical correlation between who saw the error and errors and who didn't, it had nothing to do with age, race, gender, education. The only thing that was statistically significant, if I remember correctly, was whether the voter was paying attention, regular attention to current events. Is that right, Matt? Yeah. So I think we really have a false sense of security with the paper trail because it depends on people actually using it to verify the results. And if we design something that we think will work great and people don't actually use it the way we expect to, then we haven't really solved the problem. So the security studies, I think, have shown us that. They've also demonstrated that viral exploits can defeat this form of verification. We also saw, we've got an investigation and potential prosecution underway in Kentucky where there actually was a conspiracy when voters moved first to touch screen voting for poll workers to instruct voters that when they completed their voting, they could leave the polling place, even though there's actually another screen, a cast ballot screen that was required to be used. And what would happen then was the poll worker could go into the polling place, go back through the screens, change the votes, and cast the voter's ballot without the knowledge of the voter. So that is a transitional and instructional problem, but nonetheless, it's not something that I would have thought of and not something that any of our team identified as a potential means of tampering. And the point just is that there are all kinds of things that creative human minds will figure out to do to defeat whatever it is that we put in place. So there are lots of people who will argue that before the advent of electronic voting, there were plenty of instances of election fraud using good old-fashioned paper ballots. And I grew up in Illinois, not far outside Chicago, so I'm certainly not going to argue that there's not a history of election fraud in this country, or at least concerns about it or rumors about it. I don't actually know what happened in Chicago over elections. I do know that it was regularly reported that in Chicago people were encouraged to vote early and often. I also know that on one trip to New Orleans, I was asked by an elections official if I knew why people were buried above ground. And I said, of course, you know, the water table, blah, blah, blah. And the person said to me, no, it's easier to get them to the polls from there. Again, I can't make this up. But I am not talking about old-fashioned paper ballots. I am talking only about optical scan ballots, where as soon as the ballot is scanned, the scanner stores an independent electronic record of the votes. The existence of that record makes it hard to get away with subsequent attempts to destroy, add to, or alter the ballots. When we use precinct-based optical scanners, the electronic record is created immediately when the voter feeds his or her own voted ballot through the scanner before any mischief can possibly occur during transportation and storage of ballots. And in the old paper ballot scheme, certainly mischief during transportation and storage as well as tallying were significant problems. So it's really kind of ironic because what we've done is flip the model of electronic voting with a paper record backup on its head, and in its place we have paper voting with an electronic backup so that we can learn the tally very quickly, and we can determine if the results in the polling place are not the same as the results that we got when the ballots are taken downtown and counted. The second major advantage of paper ballots, and I am using the word ballot deliberately rather than trails or records, is their permanence and auditability. The research on electronic voting systems shows that electronic vote records and audit logs are subject to undetectable wholesale alteration. That means that, as with the lever voting machine, we can't tell when someone has been in the system. And I've had this argument with certain elections officials who say to me, I've conducted many elections on all DRE equipment and we've never had any tampering. And my answer is, how do you know that? How do you know that? How do you know that someone hasn't been in and changed the audit log? How do you, many of the systems we use have used Microsoft Access as the tally mechanism. And while the front end may have a password-protected proprietary login, anybody who has access to the system without access to the voting system can simply get in sideways to the Microsoft Access database and change it. And as long as they change it in a clever way so that the numbers are the same, votes can readily be moved from one column to another in a manner that's absolutely undetectable. I've also seen login systems where every single person who logs in as admin. And the password is admin, of course. So then you don't even know who really was sitting at the keyboard and who was doing what on election night. It's also very common because, particularly in small counties, I have a county where the entire IT department for the county has 2 people in it. And they don't have the expertise to handle problems that might come up with electronic voting systems on election night. So who's there? Vendor reps. That's who's there. We in California require criminal background checks before anybody volunteers in a school. However, we had vendors who were soliciting for people to work on election day as vendor reps on Craigslist. No background check. We have no idea who they are. We don't have any idea who has access to our computer records on election night. And this is really common, is that the vendor is who has the expertise, and we don't have any way of knowing who is actually doing what. Now, paper ballots can be altered too, but it takes a retail ballot-by-ballot process to do that. And thanks to the experience of our banking industry, we have many effective ways to prevent paper-based fraud through the judicious use of video monitoring and other security measures. Video monitoring is really critical. We use video monitoring in California extensively for the processing of vote-by-mail or absentee ballots. And there have been instances of tampering with vote-by-mail ballots once they come in. We had a county a few years ago where it was alleged that somebody inside had taken ballots that were undervoted in a particular race that was further down the ballot and simply helped people who had failed to vote in that race by filling in the bubble for that race. And that was actually forensically determinable because the writing implement was the same across a variety of ballots but different from the writing by the individual voter. But without analyzing the ballot, you would never know that that had happened. And that is why I have been so insistent that we conduct random sample post-election hand tallies. It is much faster and much easier with optical scan paper ballots than with the continuous toilet paper roll audit printouts that many of the manufacturers have given us. That paper is not even 2-ply. As I have said repeatedly, these post-election audits are essential to realizing the benefit of paper ballots. At the risk of stating what is probably obvious to everyone sitting here, the check on the accuracy of the scanners and the proprietary software used to do the initial tally is meaningless if we lock up or destroy the paper ballots without ever looking at them. We have to go back to a statistically significant random sample of the original records that were created when the voter voted in order to realize the benefits of an optical scan system. That is the belt and suspenders approach that we're using in California. I was fortunate, California and West Virginia, I don't know why, but the Secretary of State of West Virginia alluded that they'd had some election fraud issues many years ago. We're the only 2 states that have a statutory requirement for a random manual tally. In California, we've had it for 40 years. It's 1% of the precincts after the election that are hand audited in every single race. For voting systems in which our testing found serious vulnerabilities, I added requirements for additional manual tallies of 10% of precincts in any contest where the unofficial margin of victory is very small, less than 0.5%. If after that first hand tally the margin of victory remains under 0.5%, then an additional random 5% of precincts is manually tallied in that contest, and so on, so that we have a mechanism for determining when we need to go back to additional original records. In fashioning these requirements, I had the benefit of an excellent study that was conducted for my office last year by the Post-Election Audit Standards Working Group, and hat tip to David Jefferson of the Center for Applied Scientific Computing at Lawrence Livermore National Lab for doing that work. This method is not the last word on the best sampling methodology to reach a very high level of confidence in the results in a given contest without hand counting more ballots than necessary. But with good minds around the country continuing to work on this problem, I'm confident that we will be able to continue to refine what I think is an excellent start to this particular problem. The working group's report and all of the top to bottom documents, footnote, I'll come back to that in a moment, are available at my website, which is www.sos.ca.gov under voting systems. Not every document is available. One of the challenges that we faced in the top to bottom review, and that is a challenge more generally to voting systems, is that every single system that is currently on the market and used relies on proprietary software. And there is actually another set of reports that was available only to me and people who had signed non-disclosure agreements working on the studies because of the concerns about disclosing the trade secrets in the proprietary software. It simply adds to the problem that we have in creating transparency. Not only can regular people and regular computer scientists not see the source code generally, but they also can't see the official reports that are commissioned using taxpayer money in order to evaluate security. It really makes things much more difficult. And I'm going to come back in a minute to transparency. Other advantages to optical scan voting. First, these are just practical. One voter occupies each machine throughout the process of casting a ballot on a DRE. Long lines can and do form if there aren't enough machines, if they malfunction, or if, as has happened in California, they run out of paper to do the paper trail. Many jurisdictions outside California that have relied exclusively on DREs have been scrambling to acquire additional machines to meet the expected historic turnout in the coming November election. With optical scan paper ballots, by contrast, a very simple voting booths can be provided for voting. All you really need is a place where people can have some privacy, and voters can use a single optical scanner for the relatively quick process of scanning. And if the optical scanner breaks or malfunctions, voting can continue uninterrupted. The voted ballots can be securely stored until the scanner is repaired or a replacement unit is available. The systems also turn out to be much less expensive to buy, operate, maintain, and store. Many jurisdictions in this country have suffered severe sticker shock upon discovering the true end-to-end cost of their DRE systems, including the cost of having air-conditioned storage. I remember once seeing a picture of DRE machines in one of the southern states that tends to be hot and humid, hanging from the rafters of a storage facility, much like hams would hang waiting to be cured. It's an image that's just stuck in my mind. So we have jurisdictions that are opting for optical scan for that reason alone. They're less expensive and they are tested, boring technology that we really know how to troubleshoot. So I alluded to this a minute ago, but finally, and I think probably as important as anything, is voting and counting paper ballots are things that all citizens can understand, and in the case of random hand tallies, something that all citizens can observe and understand. It does not take a PhD in computer science to understand paper ballots and hand tallies. It does take an exercise in faith for an ordinary citizen, or even an ordinary PhD in computer science, to watch while a computer invisibly tallies election results and have absolute certainty that what they're seeing is accurate. I actually thought Tom Stanionis, who's from Yolo County, put this pretty well yesterday. He said, if it takes more than 3 sentences to explain to a 77-year-old grand jury member why your voting system is foolproof, your voting system is not transparent. As an elections official, I don't believe we have the right to ask voters to put their trust in a private voting system vendor, or for that matter, in an independent computer scientist, no matter how well-meaning. The accuracy and fairness of our elections should not require that we trust anyone, and that includes any election official or any technology. In the end, ordinary citizens must be able to observe and verify this most fundamental exercise in democracy for themselves. For now, that cannot be done with electronic voting systems, although I have no idea what those kids who are in kindergarten right now may cook up. For now, we can make it possible to create accurate, secure elections that are verifiable by any citizen with a belt and suspenders approach that uses both the power of computers to accurately complete repetitive tasks like counting optically scanned pages and the check of a manual audit on the same records. That is what we are doing in California this year, and that is why I have stopped worrying. Thank you. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Hello. Hi. My name is Bill Paul. I'm from Wind River Systems. And I just wanted to ask you one thing. One of the issues that I know about is that when you actually do find, let's say, a bug in an electronic voting system or even in any electronic system like an optical scanner, and you need to fix it, they actually, I think, are not allowed to deploy the fixes until they get them recertified. And I think one of the issues is that it takes a long time to actually do that, which is why you sometimes have procedures that say, well, you should not turn the machine off while you're doing this, otherwise it could be a problem. Do you think it's possible to streamline the certification process to improve the time that they have to actually get patches out into the field? And would that actually help the situation?
Yeah, it's actually a great question, and it's one that I've raised as a member of the Accurate Advisory Board. I think there's a fundamental mismatch between the certification process, which came about when you were looking at having a system that was stable and didn't change, and anything that's software related, which is by its very nature iterative and where you will have changes. And the problem, of course, is that when you patch one thing, you can inadvertently affect other things that you don't intend to affect. And so patches are both necessary and critical and risky business. Because I mean, I don't think there's anybody in this room who hasn't downloaded a security update or a Firefox add-on upgrade and had it screw up something else that was working perfectly well before. So this is a huge challenge for the certification process. I actually don't know a good way to solve it, and would love to have the brilliant minds of the people who are here thinking about how we deal with this issue, because it really is a problem.
Rick Farrow. Yeah, I really liked your speech, by the way. It's great. The thing that struck me was when you mentioned doing the 10% recount based on a trigger of 0.5% closeness in races. That's the only trigger? You wouldn't also have a trigger like some kind of an election surprise where the polls had said this, or poll exit surveys suggest this, and yet the machines are saying something different?
It is the only trigger right now, but I think, you know, again, this is the first time in the history of the country that I know of that anybody has ever used any kind of a trigger to say we're going to do. Two states have a random audit, 2 of 50. Mm-hmm. Nobody else has a trigger. So we're looking at the triggers and thinking about where else we might require additional auditing. And we're also looking at creating a sliding scale, because the required audit in a city council race where there are 700 voters is really different than in a statewide California election where 9 million people cast a ballot. 1% is too much in some races statistically and far too small in others. So these are all places where work is ongoing, and your comments are very helpful, and I hope that other people here will think about what other triggering events should set us in motion to do some additional counting.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your talk. Excuse me. I live in Irvine, California, and in February I voted in the polling place for the first time since they had put in the electronic systems. And so I looked into the eSlate system, and looked to be one of the more secure ones out there, but I had some concerns about, you know, mostly software bugs that, you know, cause hundreds of thousands of votes to be wrong and things like that. So So I asked for a paper ballot, and I had come in just 10 minutes before the end of polling, and they had not had anybody else request a paper ballot that whole day. They had to like go through all the stuff and try to find the right forms, and they, you know, kind of put on a big show about kind of being annoyed that I was asking them to go through this. So I was curious, is that sort of typical now, and is there, will it be kind of difficult to kind of come back from the pure electronic systems because they're sort of seen to be entrenched now? And
Yeah,
the
good
standard?
question. Actually, there only are 2 counties in California's 58 counties that are still using any kind of electronic voting, and they're the 2 heart counties. Orange County is one of them. It's not a touchscreen system, as you know. It's a jog dial system. It eliminates some, but not all of the concerns. The other counties that were using DREs, I believe there were 21, all were required to move from DRE to optical scan before the February election. So people in those counties aren't asking paper or plastic. We actually do have one, the counties are allowed to put 1 DRE in a polling place because we don't have very good systems for disabled access. It's one of the things that I think have neglected very badly. We have a lot of front ends that are available to disabled people that are existing off-the-shelf technology that we don't use in the context of voting. So your experience in Orange County is going to be quite different. The experience in many of the counties that have 1 DRE per polling place is that nobody votes on it. And in fact, if somebody does, we have a requirement that the county attempt to get 5 people to vote on it in order to preserve the privacy of the voter who did vote on it, and it's often difficult to get 5 people to agree to vote on the DRE. So.
Okay, thank you.
Peter Neumann again, who has had the great fortune to testify for you when you were still a state senator. First of all, I want to applaud you for the top-to-bottom review. I think most people don't realize the enormous impact that had. The second thing is that after listening to the first 2, The second thing is that after listening to the first 2 questions, they're asking you if you were, well, are you still beating your husband, basically? Do you want to pour more money into the machines that have no audit trail, that are proprietary, that have no accountability whatsoever? And how would you do it to make it better? I think those 2 questions have completely missed the entire point of your talk, which is that the electronic machines as they exist today are fundamentally broken, and that pouring more money into trying to remediate or trying to patch or have controls over the patches or to improve the certification process, which is broken, or to improve the requirements that the Federal Election Commission is proposing, which are voluntary, of course, and the evaluations are proprietary and they're paid for by the vendors and so on. The entire process is fundamentally broken, which is the lesson of your talk. And I think people need to understand the deeper implications of what you said.
Well, thank you. Actually, one of the questions, the question about patches applied as much to optical scan tallying equipment as it did to anything else, and we are using that right now. But I agree, we really have a system that is fundamentally not working to assure people of the integrity of elections. And we've gone to what I think is the best available alternative in California right now. But we also have some 13,000 election administration jurisdictions in this country, and it is extremely difficult to get a system that has that many one-offs. If you're a private vendor, what is your incentive to try to vend to 13,000 jurisdictions? And it means 13,000 different sets of procedures, which is virtually impossible for the citizenry to evaluate and audit. So thank you. And thank you for explaining open source to the California legislature in a way that people could understand the difference between open source and we just put the code out there for anyone to hack.
Good morning, Dan Gooden from theregister.com. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the process of doing one of these manual audits, particularly if the scenario was like the presidential race in 2000, where you have in Florida, where you have very, very close margins and you have people on both sides giving great scrutiny to every little mark on this thing. What's to stop the same type of process that marred the Florida recount with hanging chads to happen with these optical scan ballots?
Well, there's no system that's perfect, and the hand review of optical scan ballots is actually generally more accurate than the computer scan, because the human eye is better at detecting the voter's intent than is the computer. And while most of our optical scanners are programmed so that if somebody puts an X or a check mark through the bubble, that will be counted by the computer, a faint mark like that can actually be missed. And it's also possible that if a voter fills in one bubble, writes no or wrong on it instead of erasing it, and then fills in another bubble, that will be counted as an overvote by a computer, but a manual tally will correctly discern the voter's intent. So we're actually better off if we're doing that. I don't see that process as being damaging. I think if it's done correctly and publicly, that it can be reassuring. I think the problem in Florida came about because we weren't counting all of the counties, and if we're going to do a count, we have to count all of the jurisdictions in a state so that we're not just picking those in which the results are more likely to change. And the press needs to be patient and to allow this incredible check on accuracy to bear itself out. So that's my plea to the press, is you may not get results at 11:30 at night on election night. If I get it wrong in California, you will never forgive me. If I'm slow, you'll be cranky for a couple days.
Niels Provost, Google. You made a very convincing argument on how paper ballots combined with optical scanners and then follow on random samples provides a voting procedure that has integrity guarantees as well as the benefits of electronic tallies. So when can we expect to see this being rolled out to all the states of the United States?
I'm only in charge of California. We have a historically diffuse system for election administration, and it varies from state to state. It's the case in 10 states that the Secretary of State doesn't handle elections. We don't even have the same person in charge in some states. In New York, there's a board of elections. In Utah, it's the lieutenant governor, not the Secretary of State. It's highly variable. It is so variable that if you ask the Carter Center that evaluates, monitors elections nationally to monitor elections in the United States, they would refuse to do so because we don't meet the basic criteria for monitoring. So I think it's going to take a lot of ground up work for people in other states to work with their elected officials and their legislatures and their governor to move us towards a system. But the information is there now, and I believe really strongly that if you put out good information and tools, that over time the changes will occur everywhere.
Hello, Josh Benelo, Microsoft Research. I'm also very appreciative of all the great work that you've done in this area and in improving what we have today. I'm also very, very much in agreement with what you said about wanting every voter to be able to verify the accuracy of an election without having to trust the equipment or election officials or anybody, any part of the system. I know how to achieve that with the so-called end-to-end systems. I don't know how to achieve that even with optical scan systems today. We could put end-to-end on optical scan, but with ordinary optical scan, I don't know how I, as an individual voter, can really gain confidence and verify that the tally is correct.
What do you mean by end-to-end systems?
The ones that are generally cryptographic based, but there are other similar approaches that give an external check.
I think my issue with cryptography is that you basically just move the black box from one part of the process to another. When you set up a cryptographic process, you're still establishing something that no normal citizen can assure, and that's also extremely complicated and that people in this room sometimes get wrong. So, you know, it's a very interesting idea, and I think I certainly don't rule out any change or innovation in current use, but you know, I had a hard time when I was carrying the bill that established digital signature standards in California, explaining to people what PKI was. So asking people, you know, I mean, asking the janitor who's cleaning the rooms here to understand public key encryption or cryptographic systems is a pretty big challenge for transparency.
Nick Weaver, International Computer Science Institute. Random question, do recount requests trigger an audit for that election, or for that issue?
Well, in California, I distinguish between the 1% random audit, that's the law, the new standards that we have that are triggered by close races, and then the recount, which is a different animal entirely. A recount occurs when requested by a candidate. The big difference between a recount and the audit standards that I put in place is that a recount must be paid for by a candidate up front. And so a recount requires that a candidate raise funds to pay for it. The cost of a recount per vote in California varies highly from county to county. It varies from under 25 cents a vote in some counties to over $1 per vote cast in some counties, and something that we're beginning to look at is why are the recount costs so variable. It also requires that the candidate be willing to publicly say, I'm not so sure about the results, and that in and of itself is a problem. I think we all have an interest in having accurate results, and to the extent that we can put in place auditing standards and systems that that mean that we don't need to rely on private fundraising and candidate requests, I think we'll all be better off.
But let me clarify. If I'm paying for a recount, that means that I can at least have some randomized subset examined by hand using the same procedures.
No, everything gets examined by hand.
Okay.
In a recount, it's all examined by hand.
Okay, so there's no way for me to say 10% recount.
No.
It's-
Recount is all or not, all of the ballots or none of the ballots. So we don't have a, I mean, you're way too sophisticated for election law. And, you know, it's a pretty simple process. You know, you get to the end of it, the elections officials certify it. If you want to recount, it's everything, which means on a statewide ballot initiative, 9, 10, 11 million ballots. It's expensive.
It might be nice to offer the randomized audit for at least those candidates who understand math.
It's a very interesting idea. Although, again, I think that because the public interest weighs in the same direction, that we ought to have triggers and standards that accomplish pretty much the same thing without depending on the parties, the political parties and the candidates to be our voices for accuracy if we have questions. I want that to be automatic.
Hi, Dan Gear. I don't know if you do this in California, and if you don't, then there's no point in answering, but do you have any circumstances where, other than just checkmark kind of voting, say preferential ballot is what I'm thinking of, where there's an inherent randomization procedure that handles overages and underages for different candidates, and the randomization procedure is something where doing it by hand is extremely slow. It can easily, I live in Cambridge, Mass. It takes a week to count the ballots. If you do it by machine, the guy who wrote the random number generator is God. Nothing in between. Any comments along those lines for other voting systems?
We have a couple of jurisdictions that do have a random or single transferable vote or instant runoff voting type systems. The only jurisdiction in California that routinely uses that is San Francisco. It was relying on a scanning system that was failing to read a significant number of marked ballots, an older technology. In the last election in which they used the system, I required that they do a 25% count. They wound up doing a 100% count hand count because they found that on the same ballot, the scanner was reading some marks in some races and not in others. I have just received for certification an instant runoff voting system that I think a couple of our jurisdictions are hoping to use as soon as we can get through it. But I think you're right. You can't. That's a very complicated system to try to hand count But again, if you're doing the hand audit, that's different than doing 100% hand count.
Exactly. It's complicated both ways.
Right.
And that's what makes it interesting. Well, this is a room full of people who look for interesting special cases.
Yeah.
So, you know, there you are.
Hi, Jeff Green. I have a pretty random question. I thought you had said that by February you were requiring everyone to be on an optical scan ballot. And I know one journalist in California, Brad Friedman, had said that he'd had a receipt printed by a machine in the election in June. Is he in a special jurisdiction, or is that? But it was a voter verifiable receipt that was printed that was incorrect. Okay.
Yeah,
Understood.
Brad votes
I
in
was
Los
confused.
Angeles County, which uses a one-off system that's a modification of punch card ballots that uses a stamper instead of a puncher to mark the ballots. I know this because I also vote in Los Angeles County. So I think he used, though, the AutoMark, which is the disabled access there, which is, I think, conceptually a very interesting mechanism for providing disabled access. It uses the computer as a front end to create a printed optical scan ballot. So you can take pretty much any adaptive technology, sip and puff, audio, almost anything, and use it to mark. He had, as I understand, some major problems with using the audio technology in his polling place. So, and I think he was the only person in that polling place to request to use that equipment. And one of the things that's happened in California is we have a lot of people who are disabled who are voting by mail, because you don't have to deal with, where do you park, among other things.
Thank you.
Hermie Clark, University of Waterloo. Has your office had a chance to review the current draft of the VVSG? And I was wondering, in general, do you think it goes far enough? Does it go too far? And most relevant probably to the people at EBT, I was wondering if you had any specific comments on the innovation class. Do you think they're too open, too closed? Just any general comments.
We did review, Lowell Finley, who is the deputy for voting systems, is here in the front row, second to the front row. We basically, I believe, signed on to the comments that were provided by Accurate as being pretty much what we would have, we said what they said. And haven't really focused on the innovation class at this point. We're trying to get the basics right.
Hi, I'm Albus Ortiz Google. I have what is perhaps a stupid question. So a lot of the problems with the voting system stem from the fact that the ballot has to be secret, that there has to be no way to prove who voted for what. And that's because of vote selling and intimidation. My question is that, I mean, that's the conventional wisdom. Is that actually a problem in the U.S. in this day and age?
That's a great question. And first, thank you very much for understanding that that's the fundamental, difficult question that we cast. And it is the answer, and you all are going to be asked this. If I can use my ATM, how come I can't vote electronically? And the answer, of course, is that's not a secret transaction. There's a counterparty. There's somebody else on the other side of it who has an equal interest in verifying its accuracy. It's highly redundant. The minute you complete that, the second you complete your transaction, there's a record of it, God only knows where else, so that if the building you're in were to vaporize, the transaction would still exist even though you wouldn't. And it's not secret. So it's a fundamentally different question than trying to vote either over the internet or electronically. As to the secret ballot, I understand that evidence is not anecdote, the plural of anecdote, but I do think it is still a significant issue. I actually had someone who's works at a university in a very responsible position, who I've known for many years, came to me after the last election and said, my husband normally doesn't let me vote, and I begged this time, and he allowed me to vote, and I was so proud to be able to vote for you. And I can't tell you how profoundly affected I was by hearing that this is giving me creeps to even tell you the story. It's so painful to imagine that we still have situations in which it's really critical that people be allowed to cast a secret ballot. But I think it is. And if you look at the changes just generationally on issues that will be on the ballot in California in November, there's significant generational differences on issues like gay marriage. You know, do you really want your parents, grandparents, whatever, to be able to go figure out how you voted on that? I think we ought to keep the secret ballot.
Steve Bellevin, Columbia University. All of the alternatives that are discussed, except full manual counting, is still going to depend in large measure on software systems. Well, even if it's just to count the optical mark ballots, that with the accompanying disasters, think Bernalillo County, New Mexico in 2000, which to me was a scarier story than Florida. The current software in all of these systems, by every report I have seen, including the ones you've organized, is abysmal. We also know that it's possible to produce better quality software, but it's not cheap. Do you think that jurisdictions around the country are willing to pay for high quality software development? As good as it can be, and it can't be great, can't be perfect, but it'll be a lot better than it is today.
Yeah, there's no question. You know, I have in my family somebody who does computer programming for nuclear submarines, which is a place where you don't want to have a mistake in your software. And I've learned a lot about development standards for high assurance software systems by talking to him. Politically, we're on different sides of the fence, but early on he told me, give me 20 minutes with your voting system and I'll change the result in a way that you'll never know. And I believe him. I think that what's happening, I think, first of all, that if you refuse to tell people where the problems are, you will have no momentum ever towards improvement. And I think that American citizens deserve to know what the problems are. You cannot assure people that the election results are right by hiding the problems. And really that's much of what we've done. We don't tell people, we don't report, we don't tell people how many provisional ballots weren't counted. We just haven't done a good job of developing a feedback system and a data-based error identification and correction system that gives us, the more we do that, the more room there will be for systems that are better. And personally, I think that the model of open source software has a lot to recommend it in this regard, because you get so many more brains working on the problem than you do in a development environment where you have a limited number of people. So I'm encouraged by some of the efforts that are going on for open source tallying software. You know, I can think of no place anywhere where having that kind of transparency and that kind of development cycle is more appropriate than when it comes to elections. So I think that, in my view, that has greater potential than asking a particular jurisdiction, you know, would you pay a vendor to create a product that, you know.
Hi, I'm Benedita from Harvard University. I want to thank you again for being here and taking so many questions. Of course, the problem.
This is how I learn, you know.
This is great. So you just said, you set me up beautifully, because you told the anecdote of a husband coercing a wife, parents coercing kids, etc. But California is doing a pretty big push towards vote by mail. So how do you reconcile the secret ballot and vote by mail?
Great, it's a great question. And again, I come back to the fact that there's no perfect voting system, and every system that we use is weighing what the trade-offs are. Vote by mail makes voting a lot more convenient for many people who would otherwise have a very difficult time getting to the polls, and I think that this is particularly true in some of our urban areas where people live in one county and work in another, and where we have a lot of people who are working multiple jobs just to pay the rent. So we also know that participation rates among occasional voters go up if they get their ballot in the mail automatically, and California allows people to choose to be permanent vote-by-mail voters. We have a hybrid system, so that if you're concerned about coercion, you have the opportunity to go to the polls to vote. That doesn't solve 100% of the problem, but it solves most of it in a way that still gives many people access to voting. We still have security and chain of custody issues. I think one of the most important things that counties can do when they're counting vote-by-mail ballots is spend $20,000 to put video cameras with a constant 24/7 web feed in every single area from the place where the vote-by-mail ballots are delivered from the Postal Service through every aspect of the processing to make that transparent. So there's no such thing as perfection. You know, we try to create as many convenient options and then deal with the downsides. Yep. But it's a real issue.
Hi. Thank you again so much for creating the top-to-bottom review and giving myself and other people in this room the opportunity to participate in it.
Thank you for your email afterwards.
I'm interested in your thoughts in a post-TTBR, post-Everest world going forward. Do you think it is still useful to do source code reviews of systems that are already deployed? And do you think there's any usefulness in continuing red team or other adversarial type exercises of systems that are either already deployed or were previously deployed?
I think it is, because we are still in the midst, in many places in this country, of debates about what system we're going to use. And while elections activists have the Everest and the top-to-bottom reviews to use and to take to their own elections officials, we still are in a period of flux, and I always think that more science and more data is better than less. So I really would like to see the country get to a place eventually where we create some minimum federal standards for elections. This is highly controversial in the real world, but it seems so very obvious to me that we have to have some consistent means. The Help America Vote Act started that. It's the first thing that ever said that people who weren't on the rolls could cast a provisional ballot, and if there was a mistake in the rolls, they actually had an ability to vote. That's always been true in California, or for a long time, but there were many states where if your name wasn't on the rolls, you didn't get to vote. The new issue that we're going to be dealing with, I think, is the voter registration systems and how the match is done with driver's license and Social Security records, what the parameters of the match are, what happens to a voter's name whose records in the Social Security database don't match their records on the voter rolls. And this was a huge problem in California, in particular for two groups of people: women, who tend to change their surnames with marital status more than men, and voters with difficult ethnic surnames, including names like O'Heffernan, tough, you know, because you don't know whether the O''H is O''H in the computer, or OH, or what, and the computer doesn't get that that's all really the same name. So we have some work to do, I think, in that direction. We have the potential to disenfranchise a lot of voters by not getting the voter registration process correct. And when I think about end-to-end systems, I start with what's on the voter registration card, how hard is it to fill out, and we just changed that in California so that it doesn't look like a tax form anymore, and going through transparency in that system. So, you know, the more science, the better. It helps. That feedback loop is what brings pressure on your elected officials to change things to eliminate problems.
Okay, I could put in a plug for the EVT papers this year, last year, for Ping's thesis, which has shown how you need only to trust a few hundred lines of code, and you do have end-to-end verification and things of that nature. One quick comment in response to Ben's question. After the 2000 election, I had a visit from an ABC camera crew, and they wanted to talk about the results of the election. And off the record, they told me that they had visited a large rest home in Florida where apparently everyone in the entire rest home had voted exactly the same way for the presidential race. They interviewed some of the occupants of the rest home, all of whom said that they'd never even applied for an absentee ballot. They hadn't voted But
That actually would not happen in California because for absentee ballots, we actually compare the signature both on the application for an absentee ballot if one is made and on the actual envelope with the signature on the voter registration.
yeah, well, in Florida,
that just wouldn't happen.
They had the manager of the rest home had the power of attorney over every single occupant, had the signatures, had forged all of the signatures, and essentially had voted for the entire rest home.
As I said, as long as we have elections that determine the transfer of power and the future direction of our countries, our states, and our localities, you will have people who take it upon themselves to find ways other than campaigning and getting people to agree with them in order to affect the outcome. And it is our task to try to figure out what all the opportunities are and to take the steps that are necessary to make sure that only citizens who are registered to vote vote, that every vote is counted as it was cast, and that every tally accurately reflects the will of the people who cast ballots. That's pretty simple in theory. Thank you.